In 1916, one man was given control of the entire American economy. Not the president, not Congress, not the Federal Reserve. One private citizen, Bernard Baruch. He decided which industries got raw materials, which factories produced what goods, which businesses would survive, and which would fail. Every major corporation, U.S. Steel, DuPont, General Electric, Ford had to get his approval. And when World War I ended, he sat at the table in Versailles, structuring the economic terms that would shape the next century. Then he did it again in World War II, then again during the Cold War. 6 presidents, 5 decades. One man pulling the strings behind every major decision. And you've never heard his name. That's not an accident. That's the strategy. Because the most powerful people in history aren't the ones giving speeches. They're the ones whispering in the ears of the people giving speeches. Bernard Baruch understood this better than anyone. He advised Wilson. He advised Roosevelt. Advised Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy. He shaped industrial policy, nuclear policy, economic policy. And he did it all from a park bench across from the White House, where politicians would come to him like subjects visiting a king. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's documented history. It's been deliberately left out of history books. Because once you understand how Baruch operated, you understand how power really works. And the people who benefit from that system would prefer you didn't know. Let me show you exactly who Bernard Baruch was. How he accumulated more power than any elected official in the 20th century, and why his model of invisible influence is more relevant today than ever. Because the system Baruch created the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington, the unelected advisors shaping policy, the invisible networks controlling decisions, that system is still running. It's just gotten better at hiding. Let me start with why one man specifically. Why not a committee? Why not elected officials? Why not institutional oversight? Because power concentrates around competence during crisis. Baruch proved his competence early. By age 30, he'd made his first $1 million speculating on Wall Street. That's $35 million in today's money. But what separated Baruch wasn't just that he made money, it was how he made it. Disciplined, analytical, unemotional. He studied companies. He understood industries. He predicted market movements before they happened. Most importantly, he knew when to exit before crashes. This skill recognizing market tops and converting to cash before everyone else, this is what caught the attention of Washington, because governments face the same problem as traders. They need to know what's coming before it arrives. They need someone who can see around corners. Baruch could do that. So when America entered World War I and needed someone to organize industrial production, they chose him, not a general, not a politician. A Wall Street speculator who understood how markets and industries actually worked. The appointment made sense on paper, but what happened next was unprecedented. Baruch didn't just advise, he controlled. The War Industries Board gave him authority over practically every business decision in America. Which industries got steel? Which factories got coal? Which companies got contracts? How much they could charge? What they could produce? One man making decisions for the entire economy, and it worked spectacularly. American industrial production doubled in 18 months. Factories that made cars started making tanks. Textile mills made uniforms. Chemical companies made explosives. Baruch coordinated all of it with ruthless efficiency. No debates, no committees, no bureaucracy. Just one man with total authority making fast decisions. The result? America produced more war material than all the other Allied powers combined. We won the war because Baruch figured out how to turn the American economy into a machine he controlled. Now here's what's critical to understand. Baruch didn't just organize production, he created relationships. Every major industrialist in America owed their wartime profits to Baruch's decisions. He could make a company rich or destroy it with one phone call. That created loyalty. That created obligation. After the war, when Baruch returned to private life, those industrialists didn't forget. When he called, they answered. When he needed something, they delivered. He built a network of power that transcended any official position. This is the Baruch model. Step 1. Prove competence during crisis. Step 2. Use that authority to create obligations. Step 3. Leverage those relationships after leaving office. It's the revolving door perfected decades before people had a name for it. And Baruch used this model over and over for 50 years. After World War I, Baruch was part of the American delegation to Versailles. He wasn't the headline. Wilson was the president, pushing his League of Nations. But Baruch was in the room when they structured Germany's reparations. The terms that would require Germany to pay 132 billion gold marks, an impossible amount. But why demand the impossible? Because it created permanent financial dependence. Germany would have to keep borrowing to make payments. Those loans would be arranged by international banks. Banks that happened to have relationships with Baruch. It was a debt trap disguised as justice. Baruch later claimed he warned that the reparations were too harsh, that they'd lead to economic chaos in Germany. That chaos would breed extremism. It was right. Within 15 years, Hitler rose to power on the economic devastation created by Versailles. Whether Baruch could have stopped it is debatable. What's certain is that he saw it coming and said so. But nobody listened, because politicians rarely listen to warnings that contradict what they want to believe. Throughout the 1920s, Baruch operated as a private citizen, but his influence never stopped. He advised 3 presidents: Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. He continued trading on Wall Street, multiplying his fortune. Critically, he saw the 1929 crash coming. He converted to cash before the peak. He bought gold before the collapse. When the market fell 89% and wiped out millions of Americans, Baruch was protected. He even profited by shorting stocks on the way down. This is trade 1, trade 2, trade 3. The same pattern we've discussed before. Baruch executed it in 1929 while everyone else lost everything. When the Depression hit, Baruch's wealth and connections made him even more powerful. Roosevelt needed advisors who understood finance and industry. Baruch became an informal but constant presence. He didn't have an official title. He didn't want one. Official positions mean accountability, scrutiny, congressional hearings. Baruch understood that real power operates without those constraints, so he advised Roosevelt privately. Many New Deal policies bore his fingerprints. The National Recovery Administration, modeled on Baruch's War Industries Board, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, same principles. Baruch was architecting policy without any public accountability. This is where the pattern becomes clear. Baruch would identify a rising politician years before they gained major power. He'd cultivate the relationship, offer advice, provide financial support. And when that politician reached the White House, Baruch had access. He did this with Wilson in the 1910s, with Roosevelt in the 1930s, with Truman in the 1940s, with Eisenhower and Kennedy in the 1950s and 60s. 6 presidents, all of them relying on Baruch for economic and industrial advice, all of them granting him access that no elected position could provide. When World War II started, Baruch was too old for an official role, but his model was everywhere. The War Production Board that managed the wartime economy, direct copy of Baruch's World War I setup. Many of the people running it had studied Baruch's methods or worked with him directly. Once again, America's industrial output dwarfed everyone else. Once again, centralized control by people who understood business, not politicians, made the difference. Baruch had proven the model worked, and 25 years later, it worked again. But Baruch's most lasting contribution came after the war. In 1946, Truman appointed him U.S. representative to the UN Atomic Energy Commission. His job: develop a plan for international control of nuclear weapons. This was potentially the most important policy question in human history. How do you prevent nuclear war? Baruch's answer was the Baruch Plan. All nuclear weapons and facilities under international control, strict inspections, severe penalties for violations. No nation allowed to have nukes. The Soviet Union rejected it. They argued it perpetuated American nuclear superiority since we already had the bomb. The plan failed. The nuclear arms race began. But here's what matters. Baruch shaped the framework: international inspections, verification regimes, penalties for violations. Every arms control negotiation since 1946 uses concepts Baruch established. Even today, when we talk about nuclear non-proliferation, we're using his structure. The plan failed, but the model succeeded. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, Baruch became a Washington institution. He had a famous bench in Lafayette Park, directly across from the White House. Every day, Baruch would sit on that bench. Politicians, businessmen, journalists would come to him. They'd sit. They'd ask advice. The press called him the park bench statesman. Sounded quaint, humble. An old man in the park sharing wisdom, but that's not what it was. That bench was Baruch's office. Those conversations were where policy was shaped, where deals were made, where information was traded. Baruch was 80 years old, sitting in a public park, and he was still one of the most powerful people in Washington, because he had something nobody else had: institutional memory spanning 5 decades, relationships with everyone who mattered, and no political ambitions that would make him a threat. He advised Truman on the Marshall Plan. He advised Eisenhower on defense spending. He advised Kennedy on economic policy. Each president had a different relationship with him, but all of them came to the bench. All of them listened. Because Baruch had been right too many times to ignore. He'd seen the 1929 crash coming. He'd warned about Versailles creating conditions for Hitler. He'd organized 2 wartime economies that won 2 world wars. When Baruch gave advice, smart people listened. By the time Baruch died in 1965 at age 94, he'd shaped American economic and defense policy for half a century. He'd advised 6 presidents. He'd helped win 2 world wars. He'd accumulated a fortune worth over $150 million in today's money. Not Rockefeller money, but more than enough to maintain independence and influence. He died wealthy, respected, and powerful until the very end. And then remarkably quickly, he was forgotten. The man who shaped the 20th century became a footnote. Ask 100 people who Bernard Baruch was. Maybe 2 will know. He's not taught in schools. There are no monuments. Most history textbooks don't mention him. For someone who wielded that much power for that long, he's been erased from collective memory. This wasn't accidental. Baruch understood that the most effective power is invisible. He deliberately avoided the spotlight. He let presidents take credit for policies he designed. He never wrote a revealing memoir, kept secrets. He maintained confidences. He operated with discretion that served him perfectly during his lifetime. But it also meant his historical footprint is smaller than his actual influence. Now here's why this matters. Here's why you need to understand Baruch's model. Because it's still operating. The system he perfected, the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington. The unelected advisors shaping policy. The invisible networks controlling decisions, that system hasn't disappeared. It's expanded. Every modern administration relies on the same model. Wall Street executives become Treasury secretaries. They implement policies that benefit their former firms. Then they return to finance, cashing in on the relationships and inside knowledge they gained in government. Goldman Sachs executives have run the Treasury Department under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Is that coincidence? Or is that the Baruch model operating at scale? Defense contractors employ former generals and Pentagon officials. Those same officials, while in government, approve contracts worth billions to those same companies. Then they retire and join the boards of those companies, earning millions? Is that corruption? Or is that just how the system works? Baruch proved the model works. Consulting firms like McKinsey advise governments on policy. Then they advise the companies affected by that policy. They're on both sides, just like Baruch was at Versailles. They shape the rules while advising clients on how to profit from those rules. The conflicts of interest are obvious, but the system protects itself because everyone benefits. The consultants get rich. The politicians get expert advice. The companies get favorable policies. And the public doesn't even know it's happening. This is Baruch's legacy. It's not the specific policies he shaped, but the model of power he perfected. A model where real decisions are made by unelected experts operating behind the scenes. Where relationships matter more than positions. Influence is wielded through access rather than authority. Where the most powerful people are the ones you've never heard of. Let me give you the current examples. Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, a former Harvard president. now advisor to multiple presidents and hedge funds simultaneously. He shapes economic policy while profiting from that same policy. That's the Baruch model. Henry Kissinger advised presidents for 50 years, started under Nixon. He was still being consulted during the Trump administration. That's 5 decades of influence spanning 9 presidencies. Sound familiar? Will want. I'm gonna read. Really grin wording. Former Fed chair. Former Treasury Secretary. Gave speeches to major banks for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then became Treasury Secretary overseeing those same banks. That's the revolving door Baruch pioneered. The difference is scale. In Baruch's era, maybe a dozen people operated this way. Now there are hundreds, maybe thousands, operating at every level of government and industry. The web of influence is so complex that mapping it is nearly impossible. And unlike Baruch, who at least sat on a visible park bench, today's power brokers operate in private conference calls, crypted messages, and invitation-only gatherings at Davos and Aspen. So what's the pattern? What's the lesson? Power concentrates around competence during crisis. Baruch proved his competence in WWI. That gave him access for life. Competence plus discretion, plus no personal political ambitions, equals permanent influence. Baruch had all 3. That's why 6 presidents trusted him. That's why his influence lasted 50 years. Official positions are actually limitations. As War Industries Board Chairman, Baruch had authority, but also accountability. As a private advisor, he had influence without oversight. Less authority, more power. That's the paradox Baruch understood perfectly. Relationships are more valuable than positions. Baruch's network industrialists, bankers, politicians, that network was his real asset. It persisted regardless of who was in office, survived economic crashes and political upheavals. Relationships compound, positions expire. The most effective power is invisible. Baruch let others take credit. He operated behind the scenes. He avoided controversy. That discretion allowed him to survive for decades while more visible figures rose and fell. If you want lasting power, stay out of the spotlight. Here's the bottom line. Bernard Baruch was the most powerful man in 20th century America, not the most famous, not the richest, but the most powerful. He shaped policy for 50 years. He advised 6 presidents. He organized the economy for 2 world wars. He designed nuclear policy, and he did it all without ever being elected to anything. You weren't supposed to know his name. That was intentional. Because once you know about Baruch, you start seeing the pattern everywhere. You start asking questions. Who advised on that policy? Who benefits from that decision? Who's whispering in the president's ear? Those questions make people uncomfortable because the answers reveal that democracy isn't quite what we're taught in school. Real power isn't exercised by the people we elect. It's exercised by the people those elected officials rely on. The advisors, the consultants, the experts who move between government and industry, shaping policy while profiting from it. Baruch proved the model works. Oh, it's standard operating procedure. The system he created is more entrenched today than ever. More sophisticated. It's more invisible, more powerful. And most people have no idea it exists. The choice is yours. You can ignore this. You can believe that elected officials make decisions independently. You can trust that the system serves public interest. Most people do. They're more comfortable that way. Or you can recognize the pattern. You can see that power operates through invisible networks. You can understand that the most important people are the ones you never hear about. You can realize that Bernard Baruch was unique. He was just the best at a game that hundreds of people play today. If this video showed you how power really works, if you understand now that the most influential people operate behind the scenes, subscribe to Treasury Tales because I'll keep tracking the modern Baruchs, the advisors, shaping policy. The consultants, profiting from their access. The invisible networks controlling decisions. You'll see the pattern in real time. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The system Baruch built is still running. The question is whether you'll recognize it or remain blind to how power actually works. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented history. 6 presidents. 50 years. One man pulling strings behind every major decision. Baruch, the most powerful man you've never heard of. Now you know why.